Today is going to be 13. You're not rewriting the Bible. And then next week we're going to do Philippians 4:19. And then we'll be finished with Philippians and then we'll go into our text. Okay? All right, let's do a little review then on half of the life-changing verses of Philippians we're covering are in chapter 4. And I just want to do a little progression here so you kind of see that. We did chapter 4, verses 6 through 7. The big idea here is Paul is saying, don't be anxious. And then he gives us what we call the prescription for peace. In other words, instead of anxiety, he says, with prayer, petition, and thanksgiving, present your request to God, and the peace of God will overflow you, so to speak. Okay? He starts there. Then we had a great presentation by Tommy on 4:8. And there the concept was whatever's true, noble, right, pure, lovely, admirable, think about such things. Notice these two verses are in the imperative, which means that's what we're commanded to do. So don't be anxious and think certain thoughts. Now, last week we talked about moving from the imperative to learning. Just like when you learn to ride a bike, there's going to need to be some learning. So Paul says, I have learned to be content. And we talked about the process he went through. We picked up some pointers about that. Notice so far in chapter 4, all of this is internal, is it not? In other words, anxiety, internal. What you think is internal. And then contentment is internal. Now watch the pivot on verse 13. He uses the word there, do all things through him who gives me strength. So my question to this bright class would be, is there any connection between these verses that talk about what's going on inside of you and then turning to a point where you're asked to do certain things? I can do it. Is there a connection? I'm sorry? What do you think the connection is? And how are they intertwined? Okay. So these are not randomly assigned. In other words, this is really a progression so that all of a sudden you just don't jump into 13 and say, well, I can do all things through Christ. There's this progression that talks about this is affecting how we think. This is affecting how we deal with anxiety, contentment, and now we're going to get to the point where Paul says, notice on verse 13, he doesn't say, you can do all things, does he? He says what? I. This is another I statement of Paul. So what we want to explore this morning in class is it possible for us to do all things through Christ, through strength? Paul did that. So is it possible for us? And let me make several observations. With this verse, I call this the opportunity verse because typically when you get in a situation in life that's somewhat difficult or challenging or whatever, and you search the scriptures for promises that you're going to basically write down, this becomes a very popular one because it basically says, I can do all things through Christ that strengthens me. So here's an observation. I've discovered there are kind of three challenges here. First is there's some people that see this verse and they focus on the I because they're naturally inclined to take on tough assignments. And they say, I've been looking for a verse like this. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go out and take this thing on and we're going to solve it. Where's the focus? I. When our little granddaughter periodically comes to the class, she has an interest. She's 4. Her makeup is designed around I. She doesn't contemplate anything that she can't do. A couple of weeks ago, I took her to the circus up here in, where was it, up in Duluth or way up? Yeah. Okay, so I'm jokingly saying, and it's building towards the finale is a high wire act, where this couple gets up on the high wire, pretty scary, and it's an intimate circus, so you're right there very close and you're seeing all the stuff. So I take her by the hand and we move down to the front row. And I jokingly say, I want you to watch closely because when they finish, you're going to have to do that. You know. So they're up there, just picture 40 feet off the ground doing their acrobatics, all this stuff. They start to come down at the end, and she says, okay. And I said, okay, what? She says, I'm ready. Are they coming for me? This little girl, I don't know if you have children like that, but they're wired up. They really believe they can do all things. And one of the traps here is that people with that kind of temperament, the all things people that just jump in there, tend to get in trouble when they bite this off in spiritual areas. Because as you start to see, one of the problems is it's all about you. So that's one of the pitfalls of the verses. The second pitfall I see is there's some people that are called somethingers. You know what a somethinger is? They say, I can't do all things, but there's some things I can do. And so if you're in that category, you become a somethinger. If somebody said to you, would you do X, Y, Z? Oh, I could never do that. But I can do some things through Christ who strengthens me. So my experience is we have a fair number of some thinkers around. When I was telling you my story of coming to faith when I was at Harvard, one of my problems at that time was I stuttered. And when I got to Harvard Business School, half your grade there is classroom participation. And so here I am in this group amphitheater of 100 people, and everything's, by the way, graded on the curve, which meant no matter how bright everybody is, somebody's got to be at the bottom, somebody's got to be at the top. I would go in there panicked because you had to speak out loud in front of this class with a lot of people ready to jump down your throat because that's how they made points. And I would write everything out. And you know how it is when you get around people that stutter, is they tend to find words to substitute for other words. So if you ever get stuck, then you flip to another word. And boy, I would really go through. Now, I didn't stutter just in a casual environment, but anytime there was pressure, I would move into stuttering mode. Well, so I kind of worked through that. I'd write down little words and notes. Well, when I came to faith in Christ, there was a gathering of student Christians there, and they heard what had happened to me. And, you know, in the Boston environment, there weren't that many people coming to faith in Christ. So I was billed as the pagan who's come to Christ. They said, would you be willing to speak at our next meeting? Well, this was over in Harvard Yard in the university. And before I remembered I stuttered, I said, sure, because I was so excited. And I'd never spoken publicly before. Now, if I had had a moment to think, I would have been a somethinger. I would say, well, you know, I can do some things through Christ, but I can't speak because I stutter. But instead of letting that perspective slow me down, I said, sure, I'll be glad to take it on. I got up that night, and I didn't know a whole lot to talk about except what had happened to me, because I'd been a Christian maybe at that time 3 months. And I just told my story. When I started, I didn't stutter. And you know, I haven't stuttered since. Isn't that amazing? But if I had gone into that with a perspective that said, look, I can't do this because I've got this physical malady, then we probably wouldn't be having a class here. Because that's what happens to some thinkers. Does that make sense? So you don't want to trap yourself into saying, I can do some things, but I can't do other things. This verse says, I can do all things through Christ. And then the third thing I've observed with some people is, it's called the people that say, I'll pass. And the challenge that happens there is God brings things into your life by design. We'll call them opportunities. And if your perspective is, well, you know what, I'm busy, kids are sick, I don't have my business together yet, I'm working on this, I've got this going or whatever, the tendency sometimes is to block out opportunities that God has for us. Have you heard the expression, your plate's already full? Many of us, our plates are full and overflowing. So what happens is mentally we just say, we just can't take anything else on. So when this opportunity comes along, rather than saying, you know, I can really do all things, what happens is we say, I'm sorry, I'm full. And I think we've told the story about how this class started. We just happened to be here 3 summers ago, ran into Vic and started talking about the opportunity and the need for a class here. And at that time, we were teaching a class. Both of our plates were very full. We had everything. And if we didn't watch out, we would have been a couple that basically said, you know what, this is not a good time right now. It's kind of busy and we got everything going. But instead, we were able to kind of say, well, maybe this is something God has for us. It's an opportunity. That makes sense? Okay. So what I want to do today is I want to go through how Paul developed this perspective, and then I want to talk about us, because the power of this verse is significant. Paul says he could do all things, but if that's the kind of thing we can do, can you imagine what happens in your life when different things come into your life? Instead of negativity, all of a sudden there becomes this kind of opportunity to explore what God has for you, both in good and bad situations. Okay? First, let's see how Paul arrived at this deal. If you go through the book of Acts, you get a good picture. The reason I like to focus on Paul is that we learn a lot about what he went through. Well, when he starts his missionary journey, he goes to Lystra, which is in southwestern Turkey today. And he shows up in Lystra having just escaped from Iconium, where a group of Jews had decided basically they were going to stone him. And of course, stoning was basically where you took them outside the city walls, you started throwing rocks on the person, and you basically, that's how Jews executed people. Well, what happens in Lystra is the folks from Iconium catch up with him, surround him in Lystra, take him outside the city walls and stone him. And the verse says, and left him for dead. Now, how's that for a nice career move? He's very comfortable in Jerusalem. He takes on this assignment to go to the Gentiles, and the next thing that happens, he's left for dead outside the walls. That's pretty traumatic. The thing that Paul wrestled with too is back then, the Romans had a way of dealing with unruly people. And you were unruly if you caused any kind of dissent in a Roman city, or if you didn't pay your taxes to Caesar. And they had what they called the scourge. And this, as you can see, was a whip that had at the end jagged bones, so that when you applied it to your back, the idea was to pretty much leave you almost dead, and that's why they would call 39 lashes, because typically 40 would kill you. How many times do you think Paul had this happen to him? We discover in Acts that this happened 5 times, one of which was in Philippi, where he's writing the letter back to the church. The Romans would basically put you in a stock like this, and then the guy behind would be the whip guy, and they would go 39. Now, if that happens to you one time, you're thinking, boy, I don't want to do this again. But for Paul, just imagine 5 times. Then he ends up in prison in Philippi. You remember that? He's in the stockade there, and you know, he's thinking maybe this is the end of it. Maybe this is all God wanted me to do. And then all of a sudden, God has a little earthquake that takes place, frees him from the stockade, and the jailer and a number of people become followers of Christ as a result. Then he goes to Athens, not Georgia, because this was really an intellectual center, Athens. Kelly knows that. All right. And there's a place there, I don't know how many of you have been to Athens, but right outside the Acropolis, down inside, is another hill called Mars Hill. And the idea was to get all of the intelligentsia together, and they would just debate philosophies. So all of a sudden, Paul now has to go, doesn't have to, but he ends up on Mars Hill debating all these philosophers of the age, the Western age. Can you imagine how intimidating that must have been if you've never done that before? And then he gets thrown in prison, and he ends up before King Festus, who took over part of the administration in Palestine at that time. And he has a chance to present the gospel to the king and queen. What a cool opportunity, unless you're scared to death and intimidated by kings and queens. And then we notice he's writing the letter to the church at Philippi from prison in Rome. Now, my question to you is, how do you think he arrived at this verse?
He had no other choice.
But how do you come to that conclusion? Yes. If you would have interviewed Paul at the very beginning and said, no, Paul, can you go and do all things through Christ who gives you strength? Oh, no. I don't know. But when you go through life and you look back on what you've gone through, it starts to develop a perspective. It says, you know what? I really can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. I really can do that. Now, what I want our class to do is contemplate today how to move more toward that conclusion, even at this stage of life. Paul was there because he was looking at the end of his life back and saying, listen, I've gone through these things, I can do all things. So, I want to look at three factors that will determine how much we can move towards being able to do all things. And just imagine how liberating that would be in your lives if you got into any situation, any difficulty, any opportunity, and basically said, you know what, I can do this. Versus some of the other ways of response that we talked about. So let's look at 3 points. Number one, it's going to depend on your view of God. That's a big one. There was a famous, not famous, but a very popular book written a number of years ago, Your God is Too Small. And the whole thesis is that how you work life and do life is really based upon your view of God. If he's remote, small, and distant and busy, then it doesn't really do a whole lot for you. But if your view of God is big, involved, intimate, then all of a sudden the things become very small. But it has to start with your view of God. Secondly, your willingness to follow Christ's calling. In other words, as we know, he typically doesn't speak audibly. What happens is he gives you situations, he gives you impressions, he gives you thoughts, and your challenge is, do I let those go or do I turn and take a step? And that's really critical. Nothing happens here automatically. This is not buying an automatic transition Christian life. They don't have those. This is a manual shift, where when things come along, you have to figure out, do I push the clutch, shift gears and move in that direction? And then the third one is the dependence on God's strength. This is not about you and me. This is not about having all the gear. This is not about me. It's God's strength. And what I've done today is I've pulled 3 people together that are willing to share with the class their experience. And so we're going to take a look at them. First person you recognize, I'm sure. The little guy, what's his name? And the big guy? David. Goliath. Goliath. Now, this is a part of Palestine where there was actually a genetic group of people that averaged about 9 feet in height. One time, many years ago, when I had more interest in NBA basketball, I had season tickets, and I would take my son and his friends down to the Hawks game. And we were right next to the court, front side. And I remember my son said, Dad, let's take a break. So we had to go to the restroom. So we walked down, and we came around the corner, and all of a sudden, it just got dark. I mean, the lights were on, but it just got dark. And I looked up, and there was this giant, Magic Johnson. Now, Magic Johnson is what, 6'8"? 6'9". I felt just like a little bitty grasshopper. This guy's, now I want you to picture the 9-foot guy. That's who Goliath was. He came from a clan, it was called Anak. And so he's 9 feet, and David is a teenager. Now, some are just a little bit older than you. Just picture that. You're taking on the big guy. Now, what I want to do is I want to look at what went through his mind, because what David did, this is where he ended up. And let's see how he got there. Let's look at the verses. We want to go to 1 Samuel 17. And the boys, if you'll read that one at the top there.
David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him."
Now the context is he's just a little shepherd guy, and he's bringing a box lunch to his big brothers who are in camp before the Philistine, scared to death. Nobody's willing to make a move. And David shows up and says, "Hey, I'll go fight you." Now the question is, assume he's in his right mind. How did he reach that conclusion? Well, look at the next verse. Let's see. Britton, would you read that?
Saul replied, "We're not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth."
So a lot of encouragement from the king. The king saying, hey, go and take care of the sheep. Now look at his counter to that. Kara?
But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or bear came and carried off the sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned to me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it."
Now he's a young guy. He didn't have a rifle. But he gets attacked by a lion and a bear. And I don't know if you all have run into those creatures except at zoos. But in the wild native area, that's pretty intimidating, especially for a young boy. And what does he say he did with it? And did what? Killed him. So the question is, what does killing a lion and bear have to do with killing a giant?
The lion looked a little less intimidating.
That's exactly the conclusion David got to. Read that for us, Steve.
Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defiled the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine.
And notice what happens. He says, look, because I saw God work in my life here, I connect the dots. If he did it there, he can do it here. What would we normally say? Yes, but. This is a big dude. This is bigger than a lion and a bear. But notice David doesn't get in the comparison, does he? He just said, it happened here. God did it. This is another bad dude. And God's going to do it again. He made the connection. And he's only a teenager. I didn't think teenagers could make connections like that. But notice how his view of God is, God's going to rescue him from this situation. His God is big. It says, then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones. Why did he do that? Yes! So, look at this. He says, I can do it, not with any extra stuff. I can do it with all the things that God gave me before. And then he says to the Philistine, I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you've defied. So, how's he doing this? Through God. He never saw himself as the macho guy. He basically said, God did this before in my life. I got a new situation. It's tough. It's really scary. But God's big. So, your view of God. And sometimes what's helpful is to actually write down situations in your life where God's come through and kind of carry that around with you. So when you hit the next ditch, you pull it out, you look at it. So, wow, another ditch. That means I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, because we've been there. I got a big God and he knows everything about it. Let's look at the next one. Can you recognize that scene? All right. If you've been to the Sea of Galilee, it's not a big sea. It's basically a lake of Galilee. It's called Lake Gennesaret. So picture a lake. But the distinction is, and we were talking about this, Tony, because of its geographical makeup, the wind can come swooping down off the Golan Heights and create havoc on the lake. Now, the context of this is that it's dark. Now, have you been out, anybody go boating at night when it's pitch black? Do you? Occasionally. All right. Been drinking? The point is, it's not only you can't see anything, it's kind of scary out there. Okay? So it's pitch black, and what happens is the disciples that are in the boat, and that's about the size of the boat they have, trying to go across the other side, it says Jesus came walking to them, and they saw him. Now the only way they could see him is there's some way that he was able to make himself manifest in a dark night. And then we know the story. So what I want to see is what we can learn from this story. And I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because we're running out of time. Basically, when the disciples saw him, what were they? Why weren't they saying, oh, this is cool? You know, gee, Jesus can walk on water. But what is it that scared them, you think? Why were they terrified? Dark at night on the lake. Do you know even who it is? Yeah, I mean, this is a scary proposition because they say it's a ghost. And they cry out in fear. My point is, this is not one of those kumbaya moments of the disciples. Just picture yourself in a very scary environment. You're dropped into it. And then the next thing that happens, Jesus speaks. Now, what he's trying to do is to get a perspective to the disciples. And he always has to keep telling them, don't be afraid. Same thing with us. When we get from one ditch to the next ditch, the first thing we do is what?
Panic.
Panic. Why is that? We are human. Humans are wired to panic. We're terrified. That's natural. Don't beat yourself up. We're just human. Jesus has to come along and talk about don't be afraid. Now, this is where Peter gets a few points. Because what does Peter say? If it's you, so he's still not sure who this apparition is out there, whether it's Jesus, ghost, whatever. If it's you, what does he ask him to do? Now, why did he do that? Why didn't he just jump in the water and start going? Why did he say, tell me to come? Do you think?
When they hear his voice.
All right, he just spoke.
Affirmation that it was him.
All right? But he didn't say, hey, is that you? What does he do? Tell me to come. Why do you think he asked him to tell him to come? I'm sorry?
He's not testing.
He's not testing him. And when Jesus tells you to do something, then what is the response expected to be? Obedience. So what's happening now, Peter is framing this as an obedience issue. He's saying, because the other side of it, if you don't tell me to come, I ain't coming. Scary, I'm terrified. But if you tell me to come, then that puts this whole discussion in another ring. Now see, that's what happens in our life. As long as we kind of hang around and we're not really clear what God's calling us to do and the Scripture's not clear about it, it's a little mushy then. That's called a cool mush. You don't have to do much, you stay in the mush. But what happens then, when Christ clarifies through Scripture or speaking to your heart, this is what I want you to do, then what does it become? An issue of obedience. Jesus said, if you love me, you will obey me. All of a sudden now, this whole thing gets flipped to obedience. And look what happens. We know the story. He gets out of the boat. He walks, starts to sink. Jesus takes his hand, and then he says, you have little faith, why did you doubt? But the point is, when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Focus on the other 11 disciples. Then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, truly you are the Son of God. When they get together for dinner at night, there's only one guy that can talk about walking on water. Who was that? Peter. What about the other 11? They watched. They're part of that group we talked about that says, I'll pass. You know, we're just watching. The point is, if you're in a watching mode, guess what you miss in life? Now, Peter walked, failed, and walked, did okay. But what an impact in your life if you pulled off a walk-on-water deal. I mean, how much does that strengthen you? Now, guess what Peter's going to be asked to do later on? Give his life. Do you think it occurred to him as he's being taken? Tradition says he was hung upside down in Rome and crucified. When he's being taken to die, these things going through his mind? Sure. Hey, I walked on water. If I walked on water, bring on the next challenge. Right? But the other 11 can't do that, can they? Because they missed it. Last one. Yes. Right. Yeah, it's not about perfection, it's about obedience, as Shannon pointed out. Let's look at the last one. You guys recognize this guy? Samson. I knew it. Some of you have seen him before. All right. This is a time in the history of the children of Israel when they didn't have a king. They come out of Egypt. The time period's about 1200 BC, and God raises up different judges. And the reason he did that is the Israelis would get in trouble in the sight of the Lord doing evil, and then he would put them in timeout. Timeout was the natural consequences of doing evil. In this case, they're under the oppression of the Philistines for 40 years. So it shows you that God really has consequences for behavior, but then every time he gives them a consequence that's negative, he gives them a provision for the solution. So what happens is this woman that can't have a child naturally is appeared to by an angel, and she gives birth to Samson. And Samson grows up. The Lord blesses him. He had one proclivity, and he was a guy that liked to sow wild seeds. And that's not agricultural. He would love to go to the Philistine area and just get in bed with the Philistines, literally. And so he sees this young Philistine woman, and he tells his dad, because the dad had to make the arrangements back then, basically that he wanted her for his wife. Now look at the parentheses. Brandon, read that.
His parents did not know that this was from the Lord who was seeking an occasion to confront the Philistines.
Okay. So if you're a parent and your chief son comes home and says, well, I found this great gal, she's a Philistine, you're going to go, are you kidding me? Now think about Jewish families. You're not married, you get into all this thing. But notice that even in this mess, God's in control, because God's plan is that would happen so he could basically use Samson to free them from the Philistines. Now, that doesn't work out. So he loses his wife. One of the best men at the wedding takes his wife. So Samson builds up more animosity. And then he runs into this young gal named, what's her name? Goliath. Now, her mission is to determine his source of his strength, because Samson is cleaning up the Philistines. He's just wiping them out right and left. And so the Philistines are saying, you got to find out what the source of strength is. Now, you know the story. She finally wins, cuts his hair. He loses his strength. But look at what he writes down, or the writer said. He woke from his sleep, and what was his thought? Britton, read that.
I'll go out as before and show myself free.
In other words, and read the next sentence.
But he did not know that the Lord had left him.
How is it possible, when you're out in a ditch or taking the next step, not to know that the Lord is not in it? So you're saying, if I keep focused here, you think that's what Samson did? He got so used to being strong, it didn't dawn on him that he lost his strength when his hair was. Is that possible for us? We get so used to handling life, or trying to handle life, right? Bring it on, I can take it, work through it, whatever. And in the middle of that, we lose sight of the fact it's not the Lord anymore, it's me. So what happens? He has some consequences that are not very nice. Britton, continue.
Then the Philistines seized him, gouged out his eyes, and took him down to Gaza. Binding him with bronze shackles, they set him to grinding grain in the prison.
And you would think, this is it, it's all over for him. But again, the nature of God is restoration. And so we know how the story ends. His hair begins to grow. He prays the Lord one more time, and he says, he finally realizes the source of his strength, and says, strengthen me just one more time. And God said, I'm sorry, you had your chance. You didn't do it before. I'm not going to strengthen you again. Is that what happened? No. And that's the same thing with us. We may not get it all right, but we turn to the Lord, and he strengthens us again. So here's our challenge as a class. We want to insert our names right here. So the challenge is for each one of us to write our names for Philippians 4:13, and then be able to do the following. Ask God to give you a bigger view of who he is. Big God, knows all about you, very intimately involved in your life. He's big. Number two, when God gives you a call from Scripture or an impression or a thought, your willingness to respond will determine whether or not you're going to experience being able to do all things. And then number three, just continually, every day, reaffirm our dependence on the Lord. This is not about what I can do. I can do anything, as Jesus says, without Him. But we can depend on the Lord and not lose the source of our strength. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for this challenge to do all things through you. And I would pray it for each of us, Lord, in our lives. We would have that opportunity to experience this in Christ's name. Amen.